Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 8 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. On Energy versus Climate, we're often talking numbers, and today is no exception. In fact, we're going to talk about the IT number, the most popular number in the climate world these days. It can go by naught, nil, zilch, and zip. And of course, I'm talking about zero in the context of net zero. That's still pretty nebulous and ill-defined target for global emissions. Now, many countries, including Canada, have pledged to get their country level emissions down to net zero by 2050. And in fact, more than 130 countries have set or are considering a net zero target. And that covers 88% of global emissions, 90% of GDP, and 85% of the world's population. This is all according to Net Zero Tracker. At the same time, close to 400 publicly traded companies have followed suit with their own net zero commitments. And that is the slice of the net zero pie that we will tackle on today's show. And to do that, we've enlisted the help of Dr. Gabrielle Walker. Gabrielle is founder and director of Valence Solutions, a strategy consultancy focused on climate solutions in the sectors that are hardest to work on. After completing her PhD in chemistry at Cambridge University in the UK, Gabrielle went to the journal Nature to be the first dedicated editor on the topic of climate. And that's when she became, in her own words, utterly captivated by the issue. And since then, her career has spanned academia, the private sector, politics, and lots more in journalism and writing, including for outlets like the BBC, the New Scientist, the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and others. Now, she joins us today from London, England. Welcome, Gabrielle.
Thank you very much. I'd love it to be here.
All right. So the usual format for the next hour, we'll talk news and not news to start. Then I'll guide us through a conversation on our topic today, net zero corporate commitments. And after that, we'll get to your questions. As always, you can send them in via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please don't use the raise hand function or chat box. And our friend Mika McFarlane will help us to manage the questions and the live questioners. So let's start things off with this week's Energy versus Climate news and not news segment. So, Sara, you have something that is not news, but sort of news.
I've tried to cover both angles. I just thought this was a fun story this week from Canary Media on some of the offshore wind and sea transport electrification things that are going on. In particular, the one that was not news, but I thought was fun, was the idea that there are going to be these offshore wind repair ships that will plug directly into the wind turbine. It reminds me of this Lego set that I have where the card plugs directly into the little wind turbine. Not obviously how, an integrated electricity grid runs, but kind of a fun picture. The part of it that to me seemed more like news, though, was the development of these offshore buoys that ships could connect to as they're waiting, just offshore to electrify their operation. So you might have a cargo ship that's, gone across the ocean and then it's spending time idling in port. It's burning diesel fuel during that time. And if instead you had a bobbing buoy that had an electric cable running out to it, that ship could be basically running all of its auxiliary systems off of that electric power during that time. So, I don't know the total magnitude of that. The article talked about somewhere in the range of 3,500 vessels around the world at any time idling like this. But I thought it was just another interesting example of ways that you can do electrification kind of around the edges. But as we think about, again, in the context of getting to that net zero, we've got to hit all those edges.
And as you say, when they're sitting there idling in port, they're also burning some of the dirtiest fuel out there.
Well, in some ports. So my colleague, Jim Corbett, has been part of the working with the IMO. I mean, gradually that's been regulated down in some places. So some, like Wärtsilä, will now sell you engine systems that switch between bunker fuels and natural gas, where you run with CNG just when you're inside the 12-mile economic zone or some other zone where air pollution is particularly severe. So for air pollution alone, there are already some places where you cannot be running with bunker.
Interesting.
Cool. Well, I've got batches of news after a heady couple of weeks of clean steel announcements. So like to talk about steel. And first piece is the BMW group, that uber cool car manufacturer, has committed to increasing the use of low carbon steel in its European plants. So that's one. Yesterday, a boring old White House announcement about new climate actions to across a range of things also included actions to incent low carbon production of steel in the United States. And of note, they also announced the first ever Buy Clean task force, which is a task force that will lead to decisions to use the US federal government's massive purchasing power to support low carbon materials and production like low carbon steel. And then I guess most notably, number 3, in the last 10 days, major EU steel manufacturers have really gone all in on zero carbon steel and setting targets. Gets to the topic du jour of 2030 and 2033. And why is this news? Well, we discussed last season with Thomas Coq-Blanc of RMI, the steel is one of those sectors that's kind of gotten a free pass compared to oil and gas and electricity and the emissions reductions that they've been forced to accept through regulation. So for steel to do anything serious, we need the auto OEMs to ask for it, like BMW. We need government buy clean policies, like what that task force will lead to. And frankly, we need those enlightened EU-based companies to lead the charge, and they've done that.
Jared, I'm going to jump in to say if it's news, if it's recent, and not news if it's not, then shout out to Volvo and Mercedes, who've been doing that even before BMW came along. I think this is a massive trend in the car industry, and where those guys go, surely the others are going to follow. It's really cool.
I've got a shout out on your second one, that White House announcement, as a shout out to my class and to some amazing female leaders. So just last week, I had Jane Flagle from the White House, who I believe is really the person most centrally behind that, and Rebecca Dell, both joining my class, an amazing class at the Kennedy School of mid-career students and some older and younger people, a lot of big climate experience, where the students kind of self-define the class. It's just been really awry. But Rebecca and Jane together were one of the best climate talks I've heard in years, because they know each other really well. They have a really good rapport, but they both work in the same area of industrial decarbonization, but they're kind of on opposite sides, in the sense that Jane's in the belly of the beast in the White House. And she hinted at this announcement. But Rebecca's job is to push, if you like, Jane to do more. And so they had a really fun back and forth, and we got some sense of where this was going, which was great to see.
That's awesome. And knowing Rebecca a bit, she knows how to push. And in fact, as a little preview, she has agreed to be on a future show of Energy versus Climate. I'm sure we'll talk about industrial decarbonization. Date TBD. Watch this Bat channel.
Yeah. And I just hats off to leaders like Jane Flagle for getting these cool things done in the White House. Yeah.
Here. And I think that news, Ed, to me, the third piece is really big news, right? Because it's just another reminder of how fast these things can go, right? You had the steel industry really saying sort of for a while, it's going to be so hard. Not that it's not hard, but, we're not going to be able to decarbonize. We can't do it. And then you had the successful pilots and the pressure from governments. And all of a sudden we're talking about, the majority of them in 8 years swapping out their coal furnaces. So, that's pretty fast in the span of anything that, big equipment that lasts for a long time that you build. So I think that's just, it's big.
Yeah. And thank you, Sara, for flagging that tweet yesterday, which caused me to go back and look at those announcements. And previously, like, some of them had set phase out targets by 2045. And then you got Germany's third largest steelmaker, Salzgitter, excuse me, German speakers, for my poor pronunciation, but is phasing out all 3 of those blast furnaces by 2033. So cool. And it just really seems we're in this moment of now high action and momentum, which does get us to our topic that we're going to unpack with Gabrielle. So Gabrielle, can you help to set the stage for us, or set the table, to mix metaphors? Define for us net zero, and what is a corporate net zero commitment?
Okay, well, I'm gonna do that politician thing. I'm not answering the question first, but just making a comment on what you just said before I go into the question.
You're permitted.
It's a brilliant segue. So why is the steel industry acting now so fast? And the same for the cement industry, and the same for the chemicals, and the same for many of the other heavy industry players. And I think that, a few years ago, I was talking to all of these guys and they were saying, the general attitude was, I don't think people have noticed yet. We can keep our head down. But they haven't noticed that, cement is 8% of global emissions, steel's another 7%, and hopefully we're getting away with it. And that wasn't quite what they were saying, but it was between the lines. And then along come these net zero commitments. And maybe 2.5 years ago, just before the COVID hit, I was facilitating an event with a bunch of senior execs from a very heavy emitting industry, trying to figure out what their climate policy should be. And I said, how about having it as your North Star that you should set net zero by 2050? And they stared at me like I was a crazed hippie. And really, you just use the analogy, let's set the table. Well, right now, 2.5 years later, if you don't have a net zero target, you're not at the table. And if you're not at the table, my friends, you're on the menu. So that's why we've been seeing this massive change from, and I think, we're then seeing it's almost like the people within the companies who wanted to do this are now getting the air cover. So that's a sort of answer to the question you didn't ask, which is why does net zero matter and what impact is it already having, which comes straight on from your news. And not news. However, to answer your actual question, what is a net zero target? And what was the second bit?
So what is the net, and well, let's just start. What is the net zero commitment? And then we'll get to examples.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about it is the two words is the net and the zero. You already talked about how zero was the big number we're going to look at here. And basically we know we're filling up the atmosphere with CO2 in the same way that filling up a bathtub with water means that the level goes higher and higher, right? So we need to get to a point where it's zero emissions. So the level of the bathtub just stays where it is. It does not keep getting higher. And that looks like the latest we need to do that is by about mid-century to have even a fighting chance of sticking to the climate goals that the world has set, well below 2 degrees C. So that's the point. It's zero by 2050. By 2050, there can't be any more CO2 filling up the atmosphere. So why net? Why not just zero? And the point is that net means that any ton of CO2 goes into the atmosphere by 2050 has to be balanced by a ton of CO2 that comes out of the atmosphere by 2050. There can't be any net amount of CO2 in the air. There can't be any net extra amount of water going in the bath. The level has to stay the same. And that's what we mean by net zero. So a net zero target is for any company, any individual, any organization, any country to say, okay, we're setting a target that the emissions that we're responsible for will go to zero, net zero, by 2050. And if you want, you can ask me why it has to be net zero and not real zero. But since that wasn't your question, I'll wait patiently for the next one.
Well, yeah. So let's get to net. But to use your bathtub analogy, what you're saying is a certain amount of water in the bath is fine. But if it spills over the edge of the tub, you wreck your house. So to get to that net zero, that equilibrium, you got to slow down the flow of new water into the tub.
Until it gets zero.
And that's your net question. Still, a slow trickle will cause the tub to overflow. So we got to somehow drain some of the water out of the tub. Is that what you're getting to?
Kinda, with a couple of tweaks. Tweak one is a bath full of water is not fine. It's really not fine. We're saying that we need to try and keep the world well below 2 degrees C, but we're already getting the fires, the floods, the storms, the droughts, the climate catastrophes, and we haven't even got to 1.5 degrees yet. So a full bathtub is not okay, but that's the limit that we've set. We need to keep it to that or as low as possible below it. Okay, so that's tweak one. Okay. Tweak two is a bath is a good analogy because if we get to the net point, the bath has two ways of filling it up. We've got a tap, you can put the water in, and you've got a plug where you can take the water out. And so the reason that we say net for net zero is if there's still any water coming out of the tap, and you get to the level that you set as your maximum, you need to have water going down the plug so it actually stays the same. And the water going in is any emissions that are going to the atmosphere. The water going out the plug is any emissions you're taking out of the atmosphere. And it's a balance between them that will keep that level at the limit we set.
Got you. And taking out of the atmosphere, also known as carbon removals.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Who's making these net zero commitments? I mean, are we talking just, I'd mentioned enlightened EU companies. Is it enlightened tech companies or is it broader than that?
It's much, much broader than that, I think, interestingly. And some of the first companies to make the pledges were the enlightened tech companies, and they've gone much further. Some of them, like Microsoft, was one of the first to make one of these pledges, and theirs is net negative by 2030. And astonishingly, all historical emissions to be removed from the atmosphere, so they don't just stop the level getting to this point. They actually start to drain it again. So they're responsible for no net emissions by the time they get to 2050. Others have set 2050 net zero targets. That's the gold standard that's been set by the United Nations Race to Zero, which has been a very big player in getting so many different so-called non-state actors to make these pledges. So governments have been making the pledges, but also regions have been doing it, states have been doing it, companies, corporations have been doing it. And they all do it slightly differently, and they all mean slightly different things. And some of them look very robust and some of them look very dodgy, frankly.
Yeah. And so last question, then we'll get to sort of our three weighty questions, and we'll bring in David and Sara. But so some companies are making these commitments, but some aren't. So what is the business case for making them? Or is it simply now a cost of doing business if you're a transnational Fortune 500 business these days?
So why would you do it? Why would you not do it? I think the thing I said before, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, has really put the frighteners on a lot of people. So if you think about, we're focusing on corporates here, but you did actually mention that the countries where net zero commitments have been made. And now almost every major economy has made a net zero commitment and has got short-term targets to go along to that goal. And that means that even if you haven't made your own commitment, you've also, something like north of 80% of global GDP generators are in territories, have either set their own target or they're in a territory that set it. Mm-hmm. So if you're not planning to be on that road, but the government is actually going to come in and say, we've made these commitments and we're actually going to have this policy shift, then you're actually not going to be in a position to be able to stick with the policies that are coming up, which makes you a poor investment choice, which makes you a poor choice reputationally, which means that you can't actually get the kudos of being the leader, but you're going to have to do it anyway. And if you're one of the ones that's dragged along kicking and screaming, it's harder for you to get the talent because people come along and say, why would I work for you? You're not a responsible company. And I'm hearing all these different reasons, from we can't get the talent to the investors have been putting the pressure on us. When COVID hit, I really thought that all this net zero stuff was actually going to calm down, and instead it sped up. Mm-hmm. And when I've spoken to many senior execs, and I work in more or less every different sector, they've all said to me that the investors kept the pressure on. And the investors have kept the pressure on because they've seen the potential for the value of their assets slipping through their fingers and disappearing. There's direct risk to assets from climate catastrophe, and there's indirect risk to assets from the business model changing under your feet because the policies changed, because the climate of opinions changed, whatever. And so I think those are all the reasons why companies are actually setting net zero targets. But as to how the first of all, what the target looks like, and also what the plan is for implementing it, that's quite a different story.
Well, let's talk about that plan. And I think you used the word dodgy not too long ago. So now we're going to focus on the basket of companies that have made these commitments. We're going to forget about the ones that haven't. And let's try to tease out what constitutes a good plan from a dodgy one. I spoke to a friend, a former colleague, who was doing some digging into some of the commitments made, particularly by the oil and gas sector. And he said, well, if you want to test for seriousness, kind of look for three things. One is, does the company have some sort of commiserate 2030 target that has them on that trajectory? Are they taking responsibility for scope 3 emissions? So the emissions that arise from, in the oil and gas sector example, use and combustion of their products, not necessarily within their own direct operations. And follow the money. How are they deploying capital? Are they investing capital going forward in low carbon transition, or fundamentally in hydrocarbons? So those are three tests for seriousness. But now, Gabrielle, David, Sara, what are some of the other things that we should be looking for?
It's totally unfair. He actually gives the answer and then tells us to come up with the. How can you work with this guy? Everyone needs to set short-term targets. If you don't do that, you're not serious. And it's very easy to say in 20 or 30 years' time. But I think one of the things that I've really seen that's been so interesting in this developing race to zero is the shocked realization that net zero by 2050 means something like a 40 or 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. I'll say that again, in 8 years' time, of 40 or 45% reduction in emissions. And the governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of France jointly issued a letter a couple of years ago, pointing this out and saying any companies that do not accept this reality and act on it will cease to exist. So that's a really big number. And so the second thing is, it's not just, are they using scope 3, but do they have a plan? Do they have any kind of plan, that even if it's a developing plan, even if it's one that sort of says we don't quite know where it's going to be, but and the third thing is, how are they planning to show what they've done and test against the plan so that you can actually see that they're serious in a year's time? And that's one of the things that the Race to Zero actually requires of people who sign up to it. In a year's time, you need to show how far you've gone, and by 12 months of signing up to it, you also have to show what your plan is for getting there.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think the motivations are. So you said it was because companies were worried, investors and companies were worried that they would fail and go out of business in a warming world. But my guess is that a bunch of this is driven by well-intentioned activists. That it's not that investors are truly that worried that their investments would greatly lose value as the climate warms. It's that they want to find a way to get action, that many of them actually personally care about this, and getting leverage through the financial system has been a way to do it.
So you've all lied to me about David, because I thought he was this old jaded cynic, but in fact he's just showing us that he's a real an idealist at heart, right? And actually, yes, all of these major companies have really senior people who are desperate to do the right thing. And finding a way that where doing what they consider to be the right thing is also something that they can actually get investors behind, that they can get the chief financial officer behind, is the thing that's released their energy. And I think it is. I've talked to so many global banks, and all of them at the moment that I've spoken to are developing instruments to adapt the cost of credit according to a net zero plan or a sustainability plan. So, there are financial reasons why you should do it, but they're actually loving doing that because they want to do the right thing as well. So it's amazing.
The way that but they'll also watch their bottom line. And if there's too much money that flows in those, then there will be arbitrage opportunities to short the money the other way. So the reality of money movement is a separate story, and that gets into how real this is.
It does get into that, but I think it's a realization among so many parts of the financial services sector that this has gone from being something where they could make a convincing argument that it was a trade-off. You either act on climate or you can make money, to the exact opposite. That there's actually the financial incentives are starting to build for actually shifting to the new reality, which is releasing the good intentions as well. It's sort of the beginnings of a virtuous circle.
Yeah, go ahead, Sara.
I was just going to say, there are a few other things that I would look for. And I think they're versions of what we talked about, or things I would layer on top maybe, right? So one, with that follow the money, I think for me, not only is it where are they deploying capital, but how is the executive compensation structured, right? Yeah. And so if you do not have real serious targets for your executives that are tied to emissions reductions, then, I think your plan is questionable at best, right? Because people are, on the one hand, some of them are, going to be motivated by this, but ultimately at the end of the day, the way that companies direct money, both in their capital, but also in compensation of their executives, says something about what their real plans are. So, having compensation plans that tie emissions performance to, bonus pay and things like that, I think are really important. Another one, so I think that the near-term reduction is key, and that 2030 and even before, but then also really credible understanding of how that actually leads you on a path to your 2050 net zero target. And that's where I think I see a number of plans that are sort of questionable. And it's either, it's relying, in my mind, too heavily on, magical technology that isn't fully commercialized yet, or simply isn't really connecting the dots between, okay, especially the extent to which a near-term plan is taking actions that are, say, making things more efficient, but in a way that has some sort of, limit. And you can only wring so much efficiency out of something before you're actually also going to have to change the processes. And so having both of those, having the near-term plan and the long-term plan, if you want to take the steel example, what you could be doing to reduce emissions in the near term through efficiency, and then ultimately that blast furnace swap out, that starts to feel like a real plan. The third thing that I think, and this is maybe just saying something that Gabrielle, you were saying in a different way, but like if a company's net zero plan doesn't fit in with everybody else's net zero plan, I find that also very questionable. So to me, it's not just about the scope 3 in terms of what happens to the product that you're making. And, is it believable that that's not going to be contributing to increased emissions? But is it believable that what you're producing is going to be in demand and going to be significantly valued in a world that has reached net zero? And that's one where, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around some of the oil and gas companies' plans for net zero that show basically sort of predicated on the same amount of production and consumption going on, but yet, somehow that's just going to be done in a way that doesn't release emissions.
Yeah, sure. Can I? Because I think all of those they're all brilliant points, aren't they? And but for the executive compensation, I thought that was the first real sign. A few of the European oil and gas companies started to do that. And I thought that was a really important indication of where the seriousness lies. For the credible understanding of how you get from 2030 to 2050, and also how does this fit with others, I just wanted to throw a little cat among those pigeons, because you mentioned it's not real unless it's you actually have a plan to get from 2030 to 2050 and not using magical technologies that haven't been commercialized yet. And I feel like I want to say here, I could imagine us all sitting around going, yeah, magical technologies, it's going to solar and wind. It's not been commercialized yet. I can't believe that we're actually putting effort into that or believing that it's actually going to do something. And I think we need to be really careful about that narrative that sort of says people are just throwing in magical technologies and they're not going to be real. Because the other point that really bothers me about net zero, but it's also kind of exciting about net zero, is net zero really means there's nowhere to hide, which means that every single sector has to do this. But it also means that actually we know now already that there's and this is actually really, I find this terrifying, but we've got to deal with this, and it's important, I think, is that that the latest from the Energy Transition Commission, for example, which is one of the few respectable organizations that's actually tried to look at cumulative emissions between now and 2050, has looked at the the International Energy Agency's curve for how do we get down to 1.5 degrees, what's a 1.5 degree pathway. And then it's looked at the heavy industry that's now trying to decarbonize as fast as it can. And looking at the curve for how fast, what are the scenarios for how quickly we can deploy all the technologies, not just swapping out blast furnaces, but using hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, everything we can throw at this to get down as fast as we can. And there's a gap, it's a big gap. Between now and 2050, they estimate that we're going to have a gap of 200 or so billion tons of CO2. So it's not just a question of deploying all the technologies we've got to have more stuff to deal with that. And that's where the potential for carbon removals comes in. And that's why it's kind of net. It's not just a few residual bits at the end. So we're going to have to scale massively technologies that aren't actually commercial at the moment, or we go down in flames. But what we need to do is be very judicious about working on them now and not using them as some kind of a get out of jail free in the future. Never mind, now we can do it later kind of delaying tactic. That's the important thing I'd say.
I feel like I just have to say it. It's very boring, and the other two can shut me out. But I know it. But I think it's important just first of all that climate sensitivity is still uncertain by a factor of 2 or more. So a commitment to 1.5 actually is impossible to meet through cutting emissions, because you don't know how much to meet. You need a carbon cumulative emissions or cumulative carbon agreement, which we don't have, because there's very, very wide uncertainty. And 1.5 is, of course, not a scientific target or a threshold. It's a political agreement. And that doesn't mean they're not important. I think it's important to just say that each time, that there isn't a way to translate 1.5 into a specific amount of emissions.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And it's also fair to, I think, Gabrielle, what you were saying about it's not, I was probably too glib in saying it's not just relying on magical technologies that it hasn't been invented yet, but not relying on them in a way of, we will just, something will come up. We don't need to solve that now. We don't need to have a plan for how we're going to have that plan, but somehow those technologies are going to materialize. So yeah, completely agree that we are going to need new things, but if we are going to have them by 2050 and they are going to be commercialized by 2050, then we need to be working on them now. And so if your plan involves them, you better have a plan for how you're working on them.
And I'm going to direct the conversation to the Canadian context, is with the oil and gas sector accounting for 25% of Canada's emissions, you better have a plan for oil and gas. And two things going back. One, on executive compensation. Maybe I told this story before. You can have unintended consequences. Shell had executive compensation tied to carbon intensity across its fleet, which was a material factor in it divesting of its Canadian assets, its oil sands assets. And a bunch of people said, well, we'd actually rather have Shell operating those assets than the company that came along and bought those assets. But that was tied to compensation. The second one, in talking about 2030, so let's make it real with the oil and gas sector. Because if we ask the oil and gas sector to do its fair share now and to get on that trajectory and to meet a 45% reduction target, and we take where the sector's emissions are, say, the last pre-COVID year in 2019, 45% reduction has it shedding about 100 megatons. That is a huge amount. And oh, by the way, we're sitting here February 16th, 2022. We've got 8 years, a little less than 8 years left on the clock. And we, as far as I can tell, don't have clear technology pathways to get to that level of emissions reductions within the oil and gas sector for it to do its fair share that, say, we're asking other sectors to do. So in a case like this on net zero, are we saying we're going to give the oil and gas sector a bit more time to develop those technologies so it can catch up? Or do we just call a spade and say, oil and gas sector, maybe 30%, but we're just going to hit all those other sectors harder to make up for that gap?
So wait, those numbers and that percentage, are you talking about operations or are you talking about scope 3?
No, operations.
Yeah. Because obviously the operations emissions are still significant, but I think potentially more interesting and important in terms of the impact of the oil and gas sector is what actually happens to the products. That's where most of the CO2 comes from, of course. So, we can talk about how they're going to get their operations down, but, you'll have other people saying, but shouldn't they be stopping operations? Shouldn't they be not doing new exploration? What about the IEA's assessment that we shouldn't have any new exploration production after the end of last year? And so, I think it's not a clear-cut question. And I think that the oil and gas company, and I work with oil and gas companies, I work with most players. And I think that, again, this point about zero means zero, you can't just step away and divest. I've been talking to lots of people in the asset management, asset owners sector who are trying to look at getting to net zero, not just in their own operations, but in their investment portfolios. And they say, their incentive, if they're saying, look, we're doing our thing, we're going to get to 30% by 2027, we're going to get to 45% by 2030. The only viable way for them to do that at the moment is to pull out of the high emitting sectors. Mm-hmm. And if the responsible investors pull out of the high emitting sectors, then who rolls in to take over? So I think that what I find very interesting about net zero is it is actually pushing I think many different sectors to look at in the investment world, to look at engagement, doing the kind of thing that engine number one did with ExxonMobil, where they stayed in there with their shares, managed to talk the likes of BlackRock and CalPERS and so on to vote with them, and actually chucked 3 of the directors of ExxonMobil off the board. Yeah. So it tried to change from within. So with all of that qualification, I think that if we look at between now and 2050 and sort of say, okay, it means 50% reduction by 2030, there are some sectors that can have a better chance of managing that. And there are some sectors like the tech sectors that probably can go much further than that. And it's not just oil and gas. It is, cement's going to find it really hard to do that. Steel's going to find it really hard to do that. Shipping, certainly. Aviation, certainly. So many other sectors. So I think we're not going to have a straight line, but and some are going to have to be able to move faster than others. But we do need to have an overall plan, and who gets the assignment of which is a very big issue, especially when, unlike the other sectors, the oil and gas sector's product, the thing that everyone else is burning, is actually the major contributor to the whole issue. And that's where I think it's not just a question of should they get a kind of 30% or 45%. It's how do we handle this overall narrative that as long as they're in operation, they're producing the thing that everyone else needs, but which is filling up the bathtub.
Yeah, and on the money part, on the investment part, Gabrielle, like in Canada, our big 5 banks, so much of their portfolio is made up of oil and gas companies in Canada. So in some ways you could say, well, they can pull their money out and go elsewhere. They're kind of tied at the hip, joined at the hip, which, and they're adopting, Mark Carney has been spearheading it amongst FIs. They're adopting these same net zero commitments. Pretty soon, they're going to be judged, not just what these banks are doing to reduce their emissions, which are relatively small, but their investments in the oil and gas companies, and if they're not on some sort of trajectory, whatever we decide that trajectory should be, then by implication, these financial institutions will be complicit in not being on target.
And the big danger, I just feel this is a massive danger, is that so many are saying, get out of fossil fuels, get out of fossil fuels. The activists are saying it, the shaming is saying it, and that is not going to work. That is not going to be the answer. Divesting does not help. And so it really, that's what really bothers me. But can I give another number, a scary number?
Well, let's push back. No, I don't think it's all.
No, I got to give you the number, and then let's see where we go with this. So the number is 85%. And 85% is the percentage of oil reserves that is owned by national oil companies. So not international oil companies, not companies that have shares, not companies that get lent to by banks, but companies that are owned by the governments. And so, we talk all the time about the ones that are around the edges, and they can certainly set a standard. But this is where the importance of net zero targets set by governments becomes at least as important as what's happening in the oil and gas sector. In the private sector.
I think that when it comes to oil and gas, I mean, there's also, so whether or not we get there, that's a question, right? But if you look at the net zero global total final consumption by fuel that the IEA has for 2050, right? If we reach net zero in 2050, we're using, over 3 times less oil than we're producing today, and something like 3 times less gas, right? So whether it's driven by, divestment, I don't know. But I mean, there is a substantial reduction in the amount of the stuff that's being produced, right? And I think that is...
We can't do it otherwise, it has to be.
Yeah, and I think that honestly is still missing from any conversation that the oil and gas sector is having about net zero, at least in Canada. I mean,
BP is actually, I think they were the first oil and gas super major that came out with a plan to reduce their exploration production and focus on winding down their oil and gas production as they're winding up the rest. But I think many of the oil and gas companies are also looking into how they can switch not just to renewable electricity and to be an energy provider, but also to use their knowledge of transportation of stuff and the subsurface to offer the service of actually capturing CO2 and transporting it and burying it, or at least the transportation and burying part of it. And that's going to be nobody who's looked at the numbers thinks that we can decarbonize industry without having substantial amounts of that. And we're also going to need substantial amounts of that to do that massive amount of carbon removals. And so, I think that if I were a betting person, I'd be looking to oil and gas companies that are still in play in the 2040s being the ones that are actually doing that carbon management job.
It's a small business. It's a much smaller business than our existing business, and probably a lower margin business. And I think the idea that they're going to transition over to be renewable electricity providers, the big question is, why do they have any, what's their competitive advantage in that market? I don't think it's very big.
Yeah, to go from molecules to electrons is hard. It is hard. And so, but on the other hand, they've got big, they know how to make big projects happen. They've got good local content and relationships with governments around the world. They have efficient systems for making projects happen. And so who knows? But I do think that the smart ones, and I'm afraid that Europe tends to be a bit ahead of North America and other parts of the world in this at the moment. But the smart ones have seen the numbers and are now figuring out how they can make their money in the future. And I don't know that it's guaranteed that the margins are going to be low on the carbon management, by the way.
Yeah, and I think we can go back to what we talked about previously. What are the markers of a good net zero plan? And I, before on this program, given a shout out to one company, to Suncor, which is trying to reduce its overall GHG emissions by 10 megatons per year by 2030. It's not quite 45% reductions, but not that far off, and it's got a reasonable plan. There are other companies, and I heard of one pipeline company recently that's allocating $19 billion in new investment from 2021 to 2024, and 85% of that is going to be on business as usual activities and hydrocarbons. And based on that indicator we looked at, I'd say, well, no, I mean, their net zero plan is incredible. So we're going to see a massive range of diversity. Before, I knew we'd want to talk a lot about oil and gas, but before we get to audience questions, some of which have to do with oil and gas, given that we're in Canada, let's just quickly talk about the role of non-industry actors in net zero corporate commitments. So the role of, we touched upon already institutional investors and the role they can play. What about activism? What about NGOs? What about consumers? We'll park institutional investors. Let's talk about what policymakers need to do. And then let's talk about what NGOs need to do, those two audiences.
So I'll check in first that I think for policymakers, we've all been saying for a really long time that we need a carbon price, and a carbon price will make all the difference. And that's what gives the final incentive and signal and so on. And I do think that that we need to get away from trying to pretend that there's any chance of getting a global consistent carbon tax. There isn't that kind of carbon tax on anything globally. And so, tax on anything globally. So I don't see why it's going to happen now. But I do think we're seeing more and more signs of kind of inventive ways of doing this. And certainly in the US, it tends to be more in the form of incentives like tax credits. And you've got trading schemes like in China and the European Union. You've got the talk now about having adjustable border taxes in the European Union to protect the industry there, so they can maintain those prices. And so you're starting to see sort of measures of carbon pricing around the world, which I think are really interesting. But also, I think policymakers need to really get behind what is a good net zero plan, because to be really fair to some of the companies, even the ones that are looking at whether net zero plans are dodgy, I don't think anybody really understands what we're going to have to do to get to net zero by 2050. We're all making it up. We're all making it up as we go along, because it's really, really hard, and it is going to take new technologies, and it is going to take invention. And quite a lot of the companies that I've worked with have said, we really want to do it right. What does right look like? And the answer is, it depends who you ask. Do you ask the science-based targets? Do you ask an initiative? Do you ask the UN? Do you ask the task force on the carbon market? Do you ask some of the other NGOs that are putting out these numbers? And so I think governments or the IPCC or somebody needs to really get behind, this is what good looks like. Mm-hmm. So that, and this is what can be allowed to credit in your plan, and this is what isn't credible, so that there's actually something powerful there to play for.
And I haven't paid close enough attention to it, but is there some sort of standard now on net zero plans, like some third party international standard? Nothing out there?
No, there's a lot out there, but it depends who you ask, and you can pick the one that you want. And also, some of the ones that are out there are purporting to be a bit more scientific and scientifically credible than they really are. In many cases, they're based on ideology, and in many other cases, they're kind of pulled out of the air, or they're done theoretically. In principle, this would be nice and tidy if we did it like this, but not looking at what happens in real life when the rubber hits the road. So I think we need to do a lot more work on actually getting those standards set so that we can get more people behind it. But then in terms of the activists and the NGOs, I feel like there's a lot of fear around, and that's why Sara, I jumped on your sort of magical technologies point earlier, because there is this sort of general sense that there are some things that are okay and some things that are not, that can come more from a kind of visceral gut feeling than something that relates to the numbers. And I found that about what I was just talking about how to decarbonize industry. One of the ways is going to have to be capturing the CO2 and taking it away and burying it. And I don't like it. Nobody likes it, but we can't do it without it. And similarly, this carbon removals, we're going to have many ways to take carbon out of the sky and find places to bury it. I just gave a TED talk about this. And there are lots of different ways to do it, but people can have a kind of visceral reaction and say, I don't like it because it's not purple. But if you look at the numbers, then that's, we're going to have to do it. So I think in one way, I've got a plea to activists and to NGOs just to get real about pushing people to do the things that we need to do, instead of deciding which ones are pure enough and not pure enough. But I've also, what I think activists can help break some of the log jams. That's a good Canadian metaphor for you. And one person who's doing this brilliantly is your very own Sapora Berman, who has got so frustrated with the way that Canada and many other countries will say, if we stop producing our hydrocarbons, someone else is going to do it because the demand is still there. And so, we're responsible actors, so we should actually have a piece of it. And every country in the world says that. And that just means that the amounts keep on going up. How do you get a kind of global agreement that says, as a world, we can't afford to do this? So she's got this brilliant idea of a non-proliferation treaty for production of oil and gas, where this could actually be like nuclear weapons, could be a treaty agreed by governments around the world about who gets apportioned how much, so that we can stay within a budget. And that's clever, it's inventive, it's powerful. It actually addresses that issue about, it's not just about demand, it's about supply. And I think more NGOs and activists could get behind the kinds of ideas that look at the big picture and say, what do we actually need to make happen, rather than kind of pushing just one piece of it.
And if you want to be Mr. or Mrs. Unpopular at your next environmental NGO cocktail party, go in and advocate for some kind of public expenditure on carbon capture and storage.
No. I've done it already. I've spoken, honestly, I tell you, I came to Canada, I've done it all. I've spoken to everyone from Greenpeace to Friends of the Earth to WWF, and many of them, when we go behind closed doors and we have a drink and a quiet chat, say, okay, I see the numbers, I know, but we're not going to go out there and say it.
But to be clear, when it comes, and I've had recent discussions, 400 academics signed a letter arguing against the investment tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, and storage recently. It made news, and I co-authored an op-ed in rebuttal and spoke to a subset of those academics. And when it comes down to it, what is the aggravator, the stressor for them? It's any applicability to the oil and gas sector. And I said, are you against carbon capture storage in cement? Oh, no. Generally, we're fine with that. Are you against using the tax system to drive environmental and climate outcomes? Oh, no, generally, we're okay with that. And we know that they'll do that for renewables. But anything applied to the oil and gas sector, given its controversy right now, and at this time of record cash flows, we're projecting record cash flows for this year, that it is just, people say, no, they should not be spending any kind of public money on companies where they don't see them playing in the future. Now, we've talked about it. We disagree with some of that, but that is just, that is the position that many are taking.
Common. We got this, I mean, this happened in Europe as well, and particularly in the Netherlands. And the thing is that if you make in Europe, if you're trying to say you should put carbon capture and storage on a power station, it's much harder to argue that, because there are alternatives: solar, wind, other low carbon and zero carbon alternatives. But if you're talking about cement, steel, and as you said, cement, concrete, there really aren't alternatives. There aren't alternatives that we have right now, or it could be one of a set of alternatives that could be really powerful. So I think there was a policymaker in the Netherlands who told me that they were really struggling to get public money put towards CCS projects until they said, okay, we'll take power off the table and only look at industry. And everybody said, okay, we can do that then. And so great, let's apply CCS to heavy industry, which is where it's really needed. But I think that it's not, I would like to see Greenpeace marching down the street saying, give us our CCS for heavy industry. And if you're not doing it, we're coming after you, rather than treating it as something that actually gets the oil and gas guys off the hook.
Well, keep waiting, Gabrielle. I keep waiting for that day. Yeah, let's get to questions. So, Mika, thank you. You have helped to line up a familiar guest to Energy versus Climate listeners. Robert Tremblay, you have a question.
Hey, you can all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, so my question is just about scope 3 emissions. So how much do you think is missing from corporate net zero targets by the typical act to neglect scope 3 emissions? So the way I'm kind of thinking of it is, for an electricity company or a utility, they might put carbon capture on a gas generator, and that might be net zero from their perspective in scope 1 and 2 emissions, but it obviously will create fugitive methane emissions upstream that they won't be including. So yeah, how much is missing from these net zero commitments as is?
So I don't think the fugitive methane isn't a scope 3, is it? Isn't that a direct operations? But in any case, if you look at, obviously, if everybody in the world is responsible for scope 3 as well as scope 1 and 2, then that doesn't add up, because one person's scope 3 emissions is someone else's scope 1. And so, what we're trying to get to is which of the sectors where it really matters for them to address scope 3 and where they can actually help with that, and which of the sectors where it doesn't so much. And so some of the first movers, like the reinsurance industry, or they've actually, they have almost no scope 3 emissions. So all of those are scope 1 and 2, whereas oil and gas, almost all of that. And if you look at the likes of Unilever, where, for their laundry powder, for example, most of the emissions associated with that come with heating the water at the other side. So they've been working on how to get to lower temperatures or whatever. I think with a systemic problem like this, if everybody just does their own operations, then you're not going to get anywhere. But if you actually, if you let them bleed into each other, you can find better solutions. But I don't think it's not, there's not a universal answer. It depends on the players, right?
Yeah, on one hand, I see, and I mentioned one of the 3 things to indicate seriousness of a net zero plan would be responsibility for scope 3. those emissions produced through the consumption of your product if you're an oil and gas producer. On the other hand, I look at it and mentioned the numbers before. If you're an oil and gas producer today and you have a 45% reduction target by 2030 on your way to getting net zero, just within your own scope 1, scope 2 operations, within your fence, there's so much work to be done that I almost think arguments that oil and gas producers now, and I'm about to get a bunch of heated emails by saying this from certain friends and colleagues, that asking them to then take responsibility for those scope 3 emissions and include that in that plan, I think then we're starting to get to the ridiculous. And by the ridiculous, we're starting to ask companies to do things that they are just not built to do. And I worry because we've come through, frankly, decades of climate commitments and targets that countries and companies have not met. And I don't think we're having that honest conversation around it. Which is partly why we're doing energy versus climate.
Not close. I mean, nobody's setting it. We're talking about at least 45% cuts in something like cement and 30 inside this decade. I think the scale of action required to do that would be like a wartime mobilization. There's absolutely no sign of it. And I worry, I mean, viewers will have heard this before, but I think it's really unclear to me why it makes sense to put a lot of money into reducing these relatively small upstream emissions of Canadian oil and gas, when fundamentally our expectation is that we are serious about climate, what we'll do is simply reduce the output. And so the upstream will go away because we're not producing it. And what we should focus mostly on is figuring out how we're going to get the services we need, transportation services, other energy services, without the oil and gas consumption. That's the core focus.
Yeah, I think to me, it's if the Canadian oil and gas companies' plans don't include scope 3, which many of them don't, then they're sort of ignoring the biggest part of what's facing them in the energy transition, right?
But what's facing them is just to go out of business. I don't care about them. I care about what we do in the energy transition to manage how we do what we want as citizens, which is have high quality jobs, a high quality environment, and deal with emissions. It's not written that we have to keep those companies going. What's written is we have to keep the humans who worked at them and the environment they're responsible for in good shape. And I think the kind of idea that oil and gas companies will magically transition over to be something else is just not the way industrial transformations have normally happened before. There's no reason to think of it in this case. And I think this exquisite political pressure is producing just nonsense. Is I think I corresponded with you. I was on a session with folks a few days ago in Calgary who were prattling out lines about how they were going to be carbon neutral oil or gas in a way where, when you asked the question, there was nothing under them. There's no technical background. People are just saying shit that sounds good because it's just fundamentally not their job.
There's a lot of people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people out there that are doing that, but I think I don't ascribe nefarious tendencies to most of them. I think almost nobody knows how to make net zero happen, but it's just does any net zero target have to have a credible plan for scope 3? Well, there's many cases where there's effectively no scope 3 emissions. And so, the answer is no, it depends on the sector. And then I think that many of the oil and gas companies that I've been talking to and working with are seeing a commercial opportunity for them in actually helping to do the emissions reduction of their customers, actually offering this as a service, since everybody's going to need it. So I don't feel so much that this is we do need to figure out as a society how we get our services made, but we also need to figure out how we get from here to there with all the investments that we've currently made. We're not starting from scratch.
One of the things that I think we skipped, or at least I skipped over that I did want to mention though, is so net zero targets and what you do about them. It's there's a lot of stuff in there, right? And there's a lot of focus on what companies are doing individually with their operations. But I actually think one of the examples of net zero targets or targets driving actually real action that is most clear is the case of, virtual power purchase agreements and companies buying renewable energy. And, then your story at the beginning about companies procuring zero carbon steel. I think that's one of the, to me, the most real thing that emission reduction targets have done so far is where you can actually use not only the commitments, but really the balance sheet and the contracts that companies can enter into that then, whoever they're procuring from can turn around and use as a way to get financing to actually have capital flow into the kinds of things that we're going to need in this net zero world. So, there's sort of, to me, there's almost like, I don't know, maybe it's 3 or 4 discussions under the net zero umbrella of sort of this target and what you're doing with your compensation. But then there's also really this tool that companies have as procurers of goods that can be wielded in a way that actually, I think, has transformed industries. I think it was really important in at least accelerating adoption of wind and solar, along with a bunch of other things. And that's the trick, is like, you need all of that stuff. You need governments, you need everyone else to do these things. But there are some interesting examples of how those commitments really make action.
That's why the Buy Clean Task Force is so exciting. And also, by the way, that's one of the ways that they got vaccines so fast. It was actually advanced purchase agreements and that procurement that actually got the money to be able to develop the vaccines. And it's a great analogy.
Yeah. And I think net zero, as a frame. So we've been through Kyoto targets. We've been through the previous buzzword du jour was carbon neutrality. And now we're at net zero. But its usefulness is now just getting countries, getting companies, having them think about these serious and deep emissions cuts. Where I'll ring off this webinar still very confused is what we can realistically expect in terms of interim targets. 2050 is comfortably away. We can say, yeah, we can get there and imagine a bunch of things playing out. 2030, when we say, all right, to be serious, you have to hit these road marks on the way, including 45% reduction. I still don't see it happening. And I still don't think we're having that honest conversation in the country about it. And I think our federal government, before it went off to Glasgow, now moving the goalposts and increasing the strength of a target that Canada has. Well, we didn't even have we didn't stand a great chance of meeting our old target. And now they just upped the target. I see this politicking rather than actually following the science. And I worry it's dishonest. But I'll get repeated emails about that too.
That shows you a higher target.
Exactly.
It's unethical.
Yeah, it's none of it's following the science. It's all politics, but targets can be really powerful. But do you know that? So the United Nations, we partnered with them last year, my team and I. The United Nations has this group called the High Level Champions for Climate Action. And so in parallel to the political process at COP, this group actually marshals all the non-state actors. So all the states and the regions, but also all the organizations, the businesses, the finance group, the NGOs, the anyone else like that. And they've been the ones that have been organizing the race to zero and getting all this net zero commitments. And they've actually set a set of breakthrough targets for more or less every sector for 2030. In order to be serious, to be on this pathway, we need this, we need this, we need this much renewable, we need this much energy efficiency, we need this much in each of these different, and therefore there are interim targets. And I think that's going to be a really powerful way of seeing, are we on track? If we're not, what do we do about it? How do we keep the pressure on? How do we accelerate? How do we get onto an exponential pathway and an exponential mindset? And right now, you're absolutely right. There isn't a sign of this massive transformation, but you know how we're going to get it? It's just by checking against that target and saying, okay, then how do we up the ante? And that's where your activists come in as well, right?
That's right. And ask me how I feel depending on the day. But so I've done a terrible job. No, actually, I should say I haven't done a terrible job moderating the Q&A. Robert has done a terrific job of asking a question that kicked off a 10-minute discussion. Let's squeeze in one very quick, rapid response question before we ring off for today. From Victor Dorian, and he's asking about border carbon adjustments. So maybe let's speculate. Will border carbon adjustments and now governments musing about them or trade blocs musing about them, will that be a good catalyst for us to get to net zero?
Yes.
Same.
So a quick answer.
That's a rapid response. That's a very rapid response.
There really is a sense of some movement in quite a few governments where these are going to be part of trade policy. I think, yeah.
Yeah. Even the poll.
Sorry, I was just going to say we've been talking about it here in Europe for a really long time, but now I've never seen movement quite like this, an appetite for it, and so I think it's going to happen, and I think it's going to be effective.
And I think the politics of it are a lot easier to sell, right? A tax on carbon, even trying to agree on when that's more sort of what you're doing internally to make things more difficult, or at least it's put that way. Border carbon adjustments can very well be sold as a, protectionist measure that I think is politically maybe easier to get through too. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I'll say.
Let's leave it at that. First off, thank you, Gabrielle Walker. Thank you so much for your time. It's later in the evening in UK time, so we appreciate you staying up, talking with us. I think we had a fantastic discussion. We're lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The usual reminder is this episode will be available at energyversusclimate.com. It'll be available as a pod on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Wherever you listen, rate us. Our next episode will be in early March. Off the top of my head, March 3rd, and we'll have Greg Nemitz, just confirmed today, actually, the University of Wisconsin, talking about his book, How Solar Got Really Cheap. So I think it'll be a fabulous conversation knowing Greg a bit. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Support us there as well. Thanks to Christina Pearson, Crystal Hickey, and Mika McFarland for the webinar support. And as always, our very patient producer Eva Wojnicescu. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next time in early March with Greg Nemitz.